If you live anywhere in the United States, you probably share your electric bill with some of the biggest machines on Earth. Not factories, not cities, data centers. Right now, nearly 3,000 new ones are being built across the country, and they're about to change how much you pay for power, water, and even whether the lights stay on. In 2024, U.S. data centers used about 183 terawatt-hours of electricity, more than 4% of all U.S. consumption, roughly as much power as the entire nation of Pakistan. And that's before the full wave of AI data centers arrives. A major industry analysis counts 4,149 active data centers in the U.S. today, with 2,788 more announced or under construction. Together, they represent at least $134 billion in capital spending, millions of jobs, and tens of billions in state and local tax revenue. But on the other side of that opportunity are electric bills that have climbed sharply, capacity markets pushed to the edge, and communities worried that their local grids and even their water supplies are being stretched to a breaking point. So what does that mean for you? As you know, data centers aren't new. They're the buildings full of servers that store our photos, run our emails, stream our TV shows, and, increasingly, train and serve AI models. What's new is their scale and speed. A typical AI-focused facility now uses as much electricity as 100,000 households. The largest currently under construction are expected to consume 20 times that, the equivalent of 2 million homes. These centers also cluster. In 2023, data centers consumed about 26% of all electricity in Virginia and double-digit shares in states like North Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa, and Oregon. At the same time, AI build-outs have turned into a construction race. One analysis finds U.S. data center construction spending rose from $13.8 billion to $41.2 billion per year in just 3 years. A 200% jump, even as most other construction slowed. On the ground, that money is turning into projects almost industrial in scale. For example, OpenAI's Stargate campus in Texas is ramping from a few hundred acres of dirt to 1.2 gigawatts of peak demand. Half the peak load of a regional utility serving 465,000 customers. Then there's Project Jade in Wyoming, a proposed AI campus that could eventually use up to 10 gigawatts of power, roughly as much electricity as 10 nuclear reactors produce, and more than double the state's current generation. So what changed, and why are they building data centers all over the United States? In the past few years, the demand for AI and cloud computing exploded. That capital flooded into huge campuses in states eager for jobs and additional tax revenue. However, the grid and power plants that feed the data centers move slowly. Typical solar, wind, or battery projects take around 5 years to build. Gas turbines now have wait times stretching into the early 2030s, and big transmission lines can take a decade to develop. The scale, speed, and timing mismatch is the heart of the story, and the reason it may affect everyday people more than it should. For example, Planet Money podcast interviewed Ken and Carol, who watched their price per kilowatt-hour rise from about 11 cents in 2020 to 19 cents in 2025. They live in a region that now hosts around 130 data centers. Their local utility, AEP Ohio, suddenly had data center developers asking for enormous chunks of power, sometimes hundreds of megawatts at a time. To protect itself and its customers, AEP created a new rate class and rules just for data centers, requiring them to pay for most of the power they ask for within 4 years, put up millions of dollars in collateral, and buy 60 to 85% of the capacity they request, not just reserve it for free. The logic is simple. If a developer reserves more power than they use, or never builds at all, the cost of stranded infrastructure shouldn't land on everyone else's bill. Illinois is seeing similar concerns. Consumer advocates there warn about phantom data centers, projects that reserve power but never materialize. Utilities still have to line up that capacity. When it goes unused, those costs can be spread across regular customers. To counter that, Chicago Area Utility ComEd recently signed transmission security agreements with 8 hyperscale data centers. Those customers, with a combined load expected to exceed 6.5 gigawatts, must pay upfront fees that are projected to keep more than $2 billion in transmission charges from being shifted onto existing customers over 10 years. At the distribution level, utilities are inventing new rate structures to make sure data centers pay for a larger share of the infrastructure they trigger. Now zoom out to the long-distance grid. Think of the grid like a highway system for electricity. If you want to send more power to new data centers, you build new lanes, new on-ramps, and new off-ramps. It costs billions of dollars. Utilities are generally allowed to recover those costs from the customers they serve. In AEP's 11-state footprint, peak demand took 100 years to reach 40,000 megawatts. With crypto and data centers, the company now has signed agreements for another 28,000 megawatts by 2030, in about 4 years. Those transmission expansions, again, show up in rates across all customers in the region, not just those living next door to a data center. In PJM, prices in the capacity market went up by a factor of 10, and utilities capacity payments jumped by about $12 billion in a single year. Those costs were spread across all customers in the region. A Pew analysis finds that data centers alone accounted for about $9.3 billion of the price increase in PJM's 2025 to 2026 capacity market. Another study cited in that analysis estimates that by 2030, data centers and crypto mining together could raise the average U.S. electricity bill by about 8%, and by 25% or more in the most data center-heavy parts, such as Virginia. So the system reaction is clear. Build more local wires and transformers. Build more long-distance transmission systems. Pay more for existing and new generators to be ready when demand peaks. All three cost money, and much of that money ultimately comes from electricity customers. We can see it all over the internet. Regular people on platforms like Reddit and X reporting that their electricity bills have increased by 50% or more. Based on open-source information, it is really difficult to evaluate the real scale of impact data centers cause across the country. For example, in Illinois, the latest resource adequacy report warns that accelerating load growth from data centers, EVs, and industry, combined with fossil plant retirements, could lead to power shortages and persistently high capacity prices, with capacity already making up roughly 20% of monthly bills. Consumer advocates caution that without reforms, millions of customers in the PJM region could face rolling blackouts and bill increases that make today's price spikes seem tame. Some state analyses try to quantify the long-term impact. The Natural Resources Defense Council estimates that data centers could add $163 billion in costs for PJM consumers through 2033 and increase monthly bills by about $70 by 2028. At the same time, companies and regulators are experimenting with ways to shift more of the burden back onto the data centers. In Illinois, ComEd's agreements with large hyperscalers are designed to prevent existing customers from paying more than $2 billion in certain transmission charges over a decade. EP Ohio's new data center tariff pushes developers to actually use and pay for the capacity they reserve, or put up collateral so other customers aren't left holding the bag. Microsoft has said publicly it will only connect new AI data center projects where it helps pay for the grid upgrades needed, promising to improve the grid as we grow, not just take from it, and to cover the added costs so local residents don't see higher rates because of its facilities. There's also a flip side. The America's AI Surge report argues that these 2,788 new data centers will support about 4.7 million temporary construction jobs, nearly 700,000 permanent operating jobs, and about $27 billion in state and local tax revenue over the next decade. States like Indiana, Kentucky, and Tennessee are offering tax incentives and even discounted electricity rates. In one case, a 1.5% electricity rate for qualifying facilities, in hopes that the long-term jobs and taxes outweigh the infrastructure costs. So, at the end of the day, who is covering the infrastructure costs related to the massive data center development? Currently, it seems that households and small businesses are forced to pay higher capacity charges and, in some places, higher distribution and transmission rates. Data center developers are starting to pay more directly through special tariffs, collateral, and agreements to fund grid upgrades or on-site power plants. States and cities pay through tax breaks and incentives, but may gain back some of that in jobs and tax revenue. The data center rush isn't a temporary blip either. On the demand side, the International Energy Agency projects U.S. data center electricity use will grow by 133% by 2030, from 183 terawatt-hours in 2024 to 426 terawatt-hours. Another analysis in the AI Surge report claims data centers already account for 6 to 8% of U.S. electricity use, with a potential rise to 12% by 2028 when you include associated infrastructure. On the supply and infrastructure side, the system moves slowly. it can still take 5 to 7 years to get a new gas turbine plant online. Transmission lines can take a decade to plan and build. Even wind, solar, and batteries face multi-year queues and permitting delays. That lag means that once a large data center campus connects to the grid, its effect on prices and reliability can linger for years while new generation and wires catch up. There are also non-electric constraints that don't disappear quickly. U.S. data centers directly consumed about 17 billion gallons of water in 2023, and hyperscale facilities alone are expected to use 16 to 33 billion gallons annually by 2028 for cooling. Finally, there's an emerging trend of off-grid or near-grid projects. The Jade campus plans to run primarily on on-site natural gas generation, and a proposed federal bill, the Data Act, would create a new category of consumer-regulated electric utilities, fully off-grid power systems built solely to serve new loads like AI data centers, exempt from many federal rate and reliability rules as long as they stay isolated. Even if some data centers go off-grid, the pattern is similar. These are multi-billion-dollar, multi-decade assets. Once they're in place, their demand for power, water, and land doesn't go away. So, what's the conclusion as nearly 3,000 new data centers plug into or build around the U.S. power grid? For one, electricity becomes more expensive in regions where capacity markets tighten and grid upgrades stack up, unless regulators find ways to push more of those costs back onto the data centers themselves. Secondly, the grid becomes more fragile if demand grows much faster than new resources and transmission can be built, raising the risk of shortfalls and blackouts in places that haven't planned ahead. And last but not least, local resources become more constrained, especially water and land, in communities that host gigawatt-scale campuses. At the same time, the build-out brings jobs, tax revenue, and in some cases, direct investment in cleaner power, storage, and grid upgrades that might not otherwise happen. The big takeaway is that AI data centers are reshaping how the U.S. grid plans, builds, and pays for its future. As those nearly 3,000 new facilities come online, the key question won't just be how much power they use, but how we share the cost of serving them between tech companies, utilities, and everyone else who flips on a light switch.